and thank you all for making the time to join this webinar. It's really a pleasure to be here. And as Meredith mentioned, I will be talking about the gender wage gap over the life cycle and the role that firms' wage setting has on this gap. Now, this is joint work with two women that I met back in grad school, Pang Shao, who's going to be joining Duke next fall, and Tatiana Baron, who's at Ben Gurion University. Okay, so what's the motivation for this paper? As we all know, there's a substantial gender wage differential, and more than that, it widens over the life cycle. So what we see in these figures in the red lines are the coefficients on a male dummy in a regression of log wages on potential experience and the interaction of potential experience with the male dummy. And perhaps unsurprisingly, we see that these coefficients are positive and significant. So the shaded red areas here represent the 95% confidence intervals. But adding a series of controls, in particular, actual years of experience in these green lines here, meaning controlling for the account of all periods in which workers were actually employed, and moreover, controlling also for occupation and industry dummies in these blue lines here, we still see a positive and significant coefficient. So this residual gap, this unexplained gap here, is exactly what we're trying to explain. And we think that part of it could be driven by firms' pricing behavior, by firms' wage setting. Notice, by the way, that these residual gaps are different for the high school and the college group. So likely labor dynamics are also different, and we're going to be analyzing these groups separately. Now, most of the literature analyzing the gender wage gap focuses on the differences between men and women in the labor market and how these differences translate into different wages. However, since both workers and firms are integral parts of the labor market, any public policies aimed at improving workers' welfare would be misguided if we disregarded the responses from the employer's side of the equation. Because on the one hand, we may have policies that foster labor market opportunities for women, for example, parental leave extensions, but on the other, these same family-friendly policies could have unintended consequences in equilibrium as firms respond to the environment. So the contribution of our paper is to model optimal strategies of profit maximizing firms in order to have a more holistic framework to analyze the wage disparities that arise in equilibrium. The data we use is a panel that follows individuals that were 14 to 22 years old back in 1979, and we focus on their first 15 years in the labor market. We also focus on the non-Hispanic white sample, and this is to avoid dealing with further complexities that have to do with race or racial discrimination, because this paper is really just about the gender wage gap. And as I mentioned, we analyze the sample by splitting the groups separately into the high school group and the college group. Now, this data provides us with very detailed labor market histories, together with very detailed information about the childbirth to any men or women in the sample. So let me quickly show you summary statistics pertaining to the labor market. So what we see in this table are differences between men and women in both education groups by the time they've been in the labor market for 15 years. And first of all, we see big disparities in the number of months that men and women spend in parental leave. And here it's important to clarify that the federally mandated parental leave policy in the US is unpaid and it lasts for 12 weeks. It also applies only to firms that have over 50 employees. So some of these leaves that we're seeing here are not attached to an employer. And in our model, this could be because the worker is not ready to go back to her job within the 12 weeks provided because the firm does not offer parental leave, or because the firm does not offer parental leave. And as we can see, women take more parental leaves regardless of their education levels. And outside of parental leaves, men and women also have different transition rates. So for both groups, men have a higher probability of being employed next month if they are unemployed today. And this is more salient for the high school group. And also for both groups, we see that women are more likely to be unemployed next month if they are employed today. And again, this is more salient now for the college group. So motivated by these differences in the labor market and our question, we lay out our model, of which I will only give you the intuition to tell you about the results we get. So in the model, we're going to have a continuum of firms and a continuum of workers. Firms are going to be heterogeneous in their productivity levels, and they're going to post vacancies and a wage rate, which is depicted in these balloons here, where these wage rates are chosen in order to maximize their profits conditional on their own productivity levels and the average labor market behavior of workers. And I'll be clear about what this behavior means in the next couple of slides. But first of all, our model is a model of frictions, an information friction, that is. And this is in particular the fact that workers do not know all the job available or all the jobs that are available in the labor market. They cannot simply go to the highest paying job and ask for a position there. They have to just try and go to the best possible offer that they are aware of. And so we may see a worker going into a purple firm, even if there are higher paying firms, and another worker going into an orange firm, even if there are higher paying firms elsewhere. And the wages that these workers are going to get are going to be the product between the wage rates that these firms set, so in this case, the ones in these balloons here, times the human capital level of the workers. Now, workers' human capital increases while they are employed, and so their wages are also going to grow in employment. And the speed with which this human capital is increasing in this figure is depicted by the steepness of these human capital staircases here. And we estimate the steepness of these staircases in the data. We allow for this steepness to be gender specific. Now, workers can get job offers, of course, while they are unemployed, but also while they are employed. And even happily employed workers will switch to jobs just for higher pay. There is no sense of loyalty in this model. And at any point in their life cycles, workers may have a baby unexpectedly. And once they do, they have to go into a parental leave state, which is out of the labor force, meaning they cannot get job offers in this parental leave state. And both men and women have to go into parental leave upon a childbirth. The difference is going to be that workers may go out of this parental leave state at different speeds. And in particular, in the data, we see that men are able to come back slightly faster, and they are also more likely to go back to their previous employer. So in this picture, the man, after his parental leave, was able to go back into his previous employment, and instead the woman stayed longer in parental leave, and once she rejoined the labor force, she rejoined in unemployment. And once in unemployment, she has to look for a new job. In this case, her new job offer has a lower wage rate than her previous employment, and that's just bad luck. But since that's better than staying unemployed, then she's going to take this job offer. And all these transitions that workers are doing between employment, unemployment, parental leave, and so on, is the behavior that I mentioned that firms take into account when they are setting their optimal wage rate offers. They know how much time workers in the labor market are spending on average in employment, unemployment, parental leave, and how steep their human capital staircases are. And based on that, they choose the optimal wage rates conditional on their own level of productivity. And so what this model gives us is precisely the possibility of analyzing the equilibrium consequences of different policies that foster labor market opportunities of women, such as stable employment, training on the job, and so on, and analyze the effects of these policies on firms' wage setting decisions. And although, of course, the model captures workers' and firms' decisions in a very simple way, When we estimate the model, we see that the model fits the log wage profiles in the data quite nicely for both education groups, in fact. But what we're after is really quantifying how much of the gender wage gap is due to differences in workers' behaviors and how much of that is due to firms' responses to these differences in behaviors. And in order to answer this question, what we do is exploit our model, because the model allows us to decompose the gender wage gap into the contribution of 4 components. And from top to bottom, these 4 components correspond to first, the differences in human capital between men and women. And these have to do with the different steepness of the human capital job ladders and how much time they get climbing these staircases, these human capital staircases, meaning how much time they spend employed. The second portion of this gray area graph corresponds to the differences in the wage gains that workers have from transitioning from one job to another. So remember that workers are going to switch to any job that pays a higher wage. And whenever they are doing these transitions, they are also having some wage gains. It turns out these wage gains actually differ by gender, and that also contributes to a gender wage gap. The third area is corresponds to differences in the wage offers that firms are offering to men and women. And these differences are directly related to firms' profit maximization problem, which, as I mentioned before, is going to be fully impacted by workers' behaviors. And fourth and last, here at the bottom, we have also the differences in the productivities of jobs that men and women are in. So recall that firms are heterogeneous in productivities. And in the data, we find that although men are employed in similarly productive firms that women are employed at, they are also employed in higher productive firms. And this by itself is going to contribute to a gender wage gap. But so what does this mean in terms of policy? We do several counterfactual exercises to quantify how changes in workers' behaviors could reduce the gap, where these changes could be induced by certain policies. And what we find is that improving workers' stability, women's stability in employment, in particular, decreasing their probability of becoming unemployed and increasing the probability or the speed with which they rejoin the labor force after a parental leave state would have the biggest effect on reducing the gender wage gap. For example, for the high school group, policies that help unemployed women find jobs at the same level that men do would reduce the gap by about 25%. For the college group, for example, policies that reduce their chances of losing their jobs, the chances of women of losing their jobs to the same level of men, for example, improving the job flexibility of women's jobs, which would potentially allow them to quit less for family or childcare related reasons, that could reduce the gap by about 50%. And for both groups, reducing the employment disruptions that childbirth brings to women to the level of men, that would reduce the gap by about 19%. And importantly, the biggest factor contributing to these reductions come really from the demand side, because firms respond to these policy changes, which imply a big change in workers' behaviors. So to conclude, what we do in this paper is provide a framework that allows us to analyze the wage setting behavior of firms under different policies to study the gender wage gap with a more holistic approach. And what we find is that firms' wage setting behavior actually plays a big role in explaining the gender wage gap. And our results imply that policies that improve the stability of women's matches, for example, subsidized childcare, could both increase the human capital level that women have, especially towards the end of their career, because they would be able to spend more time in employment climbing this human capital staircase, but also These type of policies would induce firms to give more equal wage rate offers to women throughout their life cycle, because their expectations of women's behavior would change. So this is in short what my co-authors and I do in this paper. I hope you found it interesting, and I look forward to hearing any questions or comments you may have.